What is a pharaoh, and what does the word mean? On this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. A couple subscribers have asked me to do a video on the word pharaoh. What does it mean? What are some of the misconceptions that surround it? Because with the rise of revisionist histories and some new religious movements, these groups have introduced some confusion over what does pharaoh mean. So today we are going to talk about what's the history of the word pharaoh, what does it mean, and we're going to do that using the misconceptions that have been presented in advance of certain views. Okay? Now, the first misconception is that I've heard recently is that the term pharaoh could mean any member of the royal court, or could have even been used by the vizier. This is a suggestion that is made by some early Exodus date supporters to suggest that the king didn't have to live near Avaris, because during the 15th century BC, the king lived in Thebes. So, and it's roughly based upon the etymology. Now, the etymology of pharaoh comes from an Egyptian word, per-a-a, meaning great house. Per meaning house, a-a meaning great. And the advocates of this view turn to the usage of house as in House of David or House of Omri that we find in Levantine texts. And this use of house suggests that it doesn't just mean a household, it means a dynasty. So they extrapolate upon the Levantine meaning to infer that the Egyptian king didn't have to be present. Any person of his household could live near Avaris, and particularly the vizier. And it would be the vizier who went out and met Moses. So there was no requirement for the king of Egypt to actually be in Avaris or near Avaris. Only his vizier. And as his representative, that vizier could assume the title pharaoh for himself. Okay? Now, there's some ad hoc reasoning going on here. Words have meanings, but they also have specific nuances in their particular language. And pharaoh is a particularly well attested in the Egyptian language. Now, the problem with this view is that there's nowhere in Egyptian literature do you find pharaoh being used of a relative of the king, his royal court, and especially not a vizier. There's no vizier that can claim the term pharaoh. In Egyptian culture, it is always used of the king. And part of this too is because the term house is used differently in Egyptian culture than it uses than, say, in Levantine or Israelite culture. You know, when you talk about the House of David, you're talking about the dynasty of David. When you're talking about the House of Omri, you're talking about the dynasty of Omri. Egyptians didn't use dynasties in that way. Like, for example, Seti would have never said he was of the house of Ramses I. And King Tut would have never said, he was of the dynasty of Amenhotep I. That just wasn't done in Egyptian kingship. So this is importing a foreign concept into the Egyptian language that isn't present there. Now, I can see in this case that there could be a counter response. And that counter response is that Pharaoh is maybe an Egyptian word that's brought into Hebrew, but it now takes on Hebrew meanings and Hebrew characteristics so that Pharaoh can be, the vizier can be called Pharaoh because of the Hebraization of the Egyptian word. There's a problem with this, though. And this attempt to steelman their argument has an issue. And that issue is that the Israelites were supposedly living in Egypt. And they were using Egyptian terms, possibly even speaking Egyptian. So it seems really, really doubtful that a Hebraization would take precedence over the native meaning, especially for a title that's as important as Pharaoh or the King of Egypt. It just doesn't make sense. So this does strike as an ad hoc reason that sort of flies in the face of what we find in Egyptian literature. Okay, so that's sort of the first distortion, that Pharaoh could mean the dynasty of Pharaoh, and it doesn't. It really is a title that is specific to the king. Okay. Now, a second distortion that kind of comes up is that there were no pharaohs at all. Now, this one is very interesting because we don't encounter this much in the West. This is much, much more common in, say, Middle Eastern skepticism. Now, in the Middle East, where Islam is the majority religion, there's things you can do and there's things you cannot do. Okay? You cannot deny the existence of Muhammad. And denying the existence of Moses will still make you pretty unpopular. So what is a skeptic, a mythicist in the Middle East supposed to do? Well, what he does is he denies the existence of Pharaoh. Okay? Pharaoh is not one of the heroes of the Islamic faith. He's a bad guy. So you deny his existence. And what happens in turn is that this compromises the historicity of Moses and in turn also Muhammad. So that's sort of the argument going on here. And it's a very interesting argument because it's sort of the parallel to the mythicists who deny the existence of Jesus in Western thinking. So, unfortunately, however, claim that none of the Egyptian kings were called Pharaoh cannot be supported. The title was originally coined by Thutmose III. And that's the first time we see Pharaoh used in the Egyptian records. After him, almost every king of Egypt calls himself a pharaoh. It becomes part of the standard title repertoire for Egyptian kings. And there's so many examples of this in Egyptian literature. It's really uncontested in Egyptology that this is the title of the king. And what's even better about this is because we can figure out with very easily when the title was first used. It's also an easily datable title. So this helps us on, say, text critical matters as well, as far as dating Egyptian texts, and even dating some of the biblical texts. It has a point of origin that is easily traced down. But this leads to a very, very interesting point as well, that about pharaohs in Egypt. Every pharaoh in Egypt was a king of Egypt, but not every king of Egypt was a pharaoh. And that's because we're dealing here with a title, and a title that occurred from the time of Thutmose III. So Thutmose III, Akhenaten, Ramses II, Shoshenq I could all claim to be pharaoh. But Khufu and Senwosret III, they were just kings of Egypt. They were not pharaoh specifically. So that leads to this very, very interesting thing that's going on here. Okay. The third misconception that I sometimes find about the term pharaoh is that only true African Egyptians could be pharaoh. Now, one finds this view represented among certain members of, say, the conscious community and Afrocentrism. You know, the idea that all culture started in Africa or in certain Egyptian revival religions. And it basically holds the beliefs that all pharaohs were descended from native Egyptian / African bloodlines. And it's based roughly around a romanticism of the history of ancient Egypt. Unfortunately, it also is demonstrably not true. Foreign regimes ruled Egypt at several times, and many claim to be the title. And many of the kings of Egypt that were non-Egyptian foreign rulers were seen as legitimate pharaohs in the eyes of the Egyptians, you know, and these included, say, more local African non-Egyptians like Libyans and Nubians, but it also included pharaohs that were outright foreigners, like the Persians, the Greeks, and even the Roman emperors. You know, Augustus Caesar is called a pharaoh. So he's as far from Africa as you get. He's a born Italian. He's a Roman. So if the Roman emperors can claim the title pharaoh, it's not really tied to ethnicity in any way. So again, I think this is a romanticism, but again, what we're talking about here is a difference here between what is say, maybe a doctrine or, say, a historical reconstruction versus what are the facts of history. And the facts of history tell a different story. Now, the final misconception I'm going to address tonight is what's sometimes raised as a biblical contradiction or an inconsistency. And that is that the patriarchs have said to have encounters with Pharaoh, you know, a person named Pharaoh, whether that's Abraham going to Egypt and having an encounter with a pharaoh, or Joseph, who goes to Egypt and serves as vizier under Pharaoh. Now, in both cases, these patriarchs are meeting with somebody who is obviously the ruler of Egypt. They're the king of Egypt. But they're coming in at a time before Pharaoh had been coined as a title. In Joseph's case, he's coming into Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, the period of the Hyksos. Abraham, he's coming in during the Middle Kingdom sometime. In both cases, those rulers of Egypt were kings of Egypt, but they were not specifically pharaohs of Egypt. This has led some people to suggest that what we have here is a contradiction, an anachronism. But the problem is that not all anachronisms are contradictions. Some anachronisms are actually retrojections. And what is a retrojection? Specifically, a retrojection is a updated language. It's updated language to meet the needs of a current readership. Okay? Now, if we take the Pentateuch, you know, where we find Pharaoh being mentioned, we have to ask the question, who is the readership? these are, if we take, say, the text of the Bible at its sort of face value, it's going to be people who have just left Egypt, maybe have been already through the wilderness, and they're coming into the promised land. That's the readership. That's the target audience. This target audience is going to date to the Late Bronze Age. During the Late Bronze Age, it was more popular and more common to call the king of Egypt by the term Pharaoh than it was to call him by the term king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay? So, in this particular case, the term king of Egypt was updated to meet the needs of the Late Bronze Age Israelite readership. So what we have here is not a contradiction or even an inconsistency. What we have is evidence. Evidence that shows the time and period in which the biblical texts were written. And I find that to be very interesting and very compelling, because it shows us that these texts, yes, a lot of Genesis probably came down through oral tradition. But in keeping with oral tradition, the vocabulary was updated while keeping the facts in place. So that sort of covers our broad overview of Pharaoh and some of the misconceptions regarding the title of Pharaoh. So what we have here is a title that originated in Egyptian, Per-a-a, which is brought into Hebrew as Pharaoh or Pharaoh. It is a term that begins with the reign of Thutmose III, and then is applied to all kings of Egypt from then on. And it really only refers to the ruling king of Egypt. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you found it interesting. And thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.